Welcome to the Ordinary Doula Podcast with Angie Rosier, hosted by Birth Learning, where we help prepare folks for labor and birth with expertise coming from 20 years of experience in a busy doula practice, helping thousands of people prepare for labor, providing essential knowledge and tools for positive and empowering birth experiences.
Well, welcome to the Ordinary Doula Podcast. I am your host, Angie Rosier. We're hosted by Birth Learning, and we have a very awesome guest with us today, a person I have adored and admired and followed and learned from for a few years now. I will let her introduce herself, but her name is Brittany Sharp-McCollum. She'll tell us a little bit about herself and the work that she does, which is so important. We actually have her present at all of our doula trainings, and it is a favorite night of those who take our doula training. So Brittany, introduce yourself, and then we'll talk a little bit about the topic we're going to discuss.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So my name is Brittany Sharp-McCollum. I own Blossoming Belly's Holistic Birth Services, which is based out of the greater Philadelphia area. I actually live in South Jersey, so I'm about 15 minutes over the bridge from Philadelphia. Let's see, I have been doing birth-related work for over 16 years in this area, as well as kind of all over the country, and I can talk more about that later on. I am a childbirth educator, I'm a doula, I'm a lactation counselor, and a perinatal pelvic biomechanics educator. And my focus in all of the work that I do is really on helping people understand labor physiology, really encouraging people to know their options and to advocate for their preferences during both prenatal care as well as labor, and then even into the postpartum, of course, as well. And then a big part of what I do is pelvic biomechanics education, which is basically teaching people how to utilize movement effectively in labor to reduce intervention rates, restore autonomy, improve birth outcomes. And one of the things that I always say when I talk about perinatal pelvic biomechanics is that movement in labor is not just for people who are unmedicated. And I think that's a big myth that's out there. People think they can only move if they don't have an epidural. And then people write off movement if their plan is to get an epidural. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So what I do as a pelvic biomechanics educator is not only teach expecting parents about how to utilize movement effectively, but I also get to travel around the country and talk to hospital groups and private practices and doulas, and really kind of share insights and information and education about how to incorporate movement into all labor experiences. And I have 4 kids. My oldest is 17, my next one's 11, and then 8, and then 2. And my path in this work really started after my first son was born. I was very intentional about the providers that I chose and where I was choosing to give birth, and I still came out of the experience feeling totally blindsided by what their expectations of me were versus what my expectations of the process were. And I realized afterwards that I should have been asking a lot more questions along the way. And I kind of just went in there assuming that my providers were on the same page as me and realized that we weren't. And it really led to a very stressful end of pregnancy and stressful birth experience. So I came out of that just feeling like people need to know their options. People need to know how to better advocate for themselves, how to navigate the system in which they're birthing, no matter what choices they're making in labor. So that's really at the heart of what I do, is helping people know how to have a positive, empowering birth experience through communication, through advocacy, through education. And that's regardless of how someone's birthing, with or without an epidural, induced labor, spontaneous labor, cesarean birth, vaginal birth, doesn't matter. We all deserve to have really positive, empowering experiences.
Oh, I love that. And you speak my language.
Oh, I know.
We could talk for a long time. So our topic today, and Brittany's amazing at this topic and just touched a lot on it, which is key, I think, like she said, to any labor. But we're specifically going to look at today effective movement with an epidural. A lot of times I think people are like, oh, I got an epidural, like stopped moving, or when I get an epidural, I can't move. That is not the case. So Brittany, tell us about how we incorporate effective movement and why it's even more important sometimes after an epidural has been used as a tool.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So I love talking about this because one of my favorite things to do in the birth world is to just bust all these myths that are out there about childbirth. And myths are perpetuated by social media as well as like media, like movies and TV shows, and all those crazy, scary stories we hear about real births on the news and things like that. And we just have so much misinformation and kind of inaccurate information thrown at us all the time. And one of those inaccuracies is about epidurals. And people believe that if they get an epidural, they can't move at all in labor. A lot of times I find that providers also believe that movement is extremely limited with an epidural, and that does not have to be the case. So yeah, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, how to incorporate movement effectively with an epidural. Before I get into some of my tips, I will say this as well. I post a whole lot of like videos and stuff like that on social media, and I always get comments from people, well, I had an epidural and there was no way I could move. And not that we're saying that's not a very valid thought, but when we understand what effective movement is and what that looks like, we realize that even if somebody has an epidural and let's say it's the heaviest epidural and they cannot like get into it, for example, in all fours position, there are still effective movements that they can do, even seated, even side lying. So we have this idea that movement with an epidural, or well, movement in general in labor, is going to be like squatting and then getting into all fours and sitting on the toilet and like doing lunges, and it can be like that, although that can
Like
also
that's
be
big
exhausting.
movement, right? Like, yeah, that's a lot of big movement.
That's a lot of big movement, and here and there, big movement can be great, but even without an epidural, it can be exhausting to be moving like that. And movement doesn't have to be that dramatic. So one of the things I think is really important is for people to understand what effective movement looks like. So I'll define that as I see it, and then I'll also share some tips on how to use that effectively. So when we're thinking about creating space changes in the body for labor, we really want to be thinking about the pelvic space. And without getting too deep into the pelvis, basically the pelvis has three layers, or levels, not layers, I'm sorry, three levels. So we have the top, the middle, and the bottom. You can think of them as the inlet, the mid-pelvis, and the outlet. And they open differently. So for example, if somebody is seated with their legs farther apart versus seated with their legs closer together, that's going to create some pelvic space changes. So when we're thinking about utilizing effective movement in labor, what we're really thinking about is what movements change space in the pelvis, as opposed to like what are the big dramatic movements that we could do. We're thinking instead, what are the movements that change pelvic space in any three of these levels, inlet, mid-pelvis, or outlet. And so the three main ways that pelvic space is changed is with thigh rotation, sacral movement, and asymmetry. So whether somebody's thighs are externally or internally rotated will change space in the pelvis. Whether somebody's sacrum is tipping forward, think about maybe rounding the back, so tipping forward, or arching the back, or tipping. Let me say that again. So let's think about the sacrum moving. So if the sacrum is tipping forward, that would be like if somebody's arching their back, sticking their butt out. And then if we're thinking about the sacrum tipping backwards, then we're thinking more about rounding the back or almost slouching. And so that's another way that we change pelvic space. And then the third way is asymmetry, doing something on one side of the body and not the other. So femur rotation or thigh rotation, sacral movement, and asymmetry are the ways that we change pelvic space, which means we could be in a side-lying position and we could just alternate the rotation of the top thigh. So imagine somebody lying on their side. Let's say they're lying on their right side, their left thigh is on top. They could position their legs so that their left thigh is open, and they could do that even with a prop, something like a peanut ball, for example, which is used a lot in labor rooms, or even a couple pillows, and they could have their thigh in external rotation. But then after a few contractions like that, they could put their thigh into internal rotation, and that could be done by putting a couple pillows between the ankles, or even sometimes, depending on the person's individual body, even just resting their top thigh on top of their bottom thigh. So when we're thinking about simple movement, we're thinking, well, the thigh could be open or the thigh could be closed. It doesn't matter if that person is seated or if they're in all fours or if they're lying down. It's just a matter of, is the thigh open or is the thigh closed? So that's one way that we change pelvic space. And then with the sacrum, it's super simple. Even again, like let's say someone's in a seated position, changing the angle of the hospital bed is going to shift how the sacrum is positioned. And then we could exaggerate that movement of the sacrum with a little prop under the lower back. So we could encourage the sacrum to open at the bottom or open at the top, depending on what the angle of the hospital bed is, or if we have a prop at someone's lower back. And then asymmetry, we could be seated and stretch out one leg and tuck the other leg kind of in at maybe a figure four position. So maybe the sole of the right foot touching the inside of the left knee. So again, we're not thinking like, well, let's get into a squat, let's get into all fours. That's not what we're thinking about. We're thinking, let's open the thigh, then close the thigh. Let's kind of sit semi-reclined in the bed. Then let's raise the hospital bed up so that we're sitting really kind of upright with quote unquote good posture. Or, let's bend the knee on the right leg, and then after a few contractions, bend the knee on the left leg. And again, depending on how heavy someone's epidural is, this may require a little bit of guidance or support from like a partner or a doula or a nurse or something like that. But a lot of people with epidurals can do those simple movements even on their own. And so again, like it's really, really simple stuff. And when we're thinking about movement, we need to be thinking, well, how are we changing space in the pelvis? Not thinking like, what are these big dramatic movements that we're doing? So that's kind of the background on effective movement and how to create that effective movement. It's all about creating that pelvic space change as opposed to thinking about big dramatic movements. I like to think of those big positions like standing, seated, all fours, reclined as our starting point positions for comfort. So maybe somebody who has an epidural is most comfortable side lying. Well, that's fine. We can do a million different things with thigh rotation and sacral movement and asymmetry when we're side lying. Or let's say somebody is comfortable in a forward-leaning position. Maybe they're kneeling over the back of the bed with or without an epidural. Well, we can do all of those 3 variations, the thigh rotation, sacral movement, asymmetry, in that position too. So those bigger positions, there are starting points for comfort. And then the pelvic space change is happening with that thigh rotation, sacral movement, and asymmetry. So yeah, that's effective movement. But then I have some tips I can share for how to utilize that with an epidural, because it's great knowledge to have, but then it can be really kind of overwhelming, I think, for people that are laboring to be like, oh my gosh, she just threw out all these words that I'm not familiar with, like sacrum and femur and asymmetry. Like, what the heck does that mean? And then you're using your thinking brain too much in labor and it's overwhelming. So just think of that as like background information. And then I'm going to share with you a couple things that you can do that you can kind of focus more heavily on during labor.
So I think a lot of people, Brittany, too, want a recipe, right? They're like, tell me what to do and when. And that's hard. Like, we don't know the ingredients yet, right? Like what we're working with until we're in labor.
Yeah.
So whether you have a doula or you don't, these are going to be helpful tips to use in any situation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no right or there's no prescriptive way to do it for everyone.
No,
right? It's so different.
It's so different. There's totally not. Oh my gosh, the number of times that I've been teaching a birth class and somebody says to me, what is the best position to give birth in? And I'm like, well, and so what I like to tell people is the best position is the one that is frequently changed, because there's not a best position. It is very dependent, like you said, on people's individual circumstances. It's dependent upon what the position the baby is quote unquote liking. It's dependent upon what's comfortable for the person laboring, how much mobility they have, what's their normal range of motion. And then, other factors as well, like how supportive is the provider? Does the person have an awesome nurse by their side? Do they have props available for their use? Do they have an epidural? Do they not have an epidural? So anyway, so many factors that's going to affect that. So I don't like to answer with a like one size fits all approach. I think the prescriptive approach, like you mentioned, is not going to work. Instead, we really need to be open to just trying different things and hopefully having somebody by our side, like a doula or a very well birth educated partner or an awesome nurse, somebody that can help provide a little bit of guidance. But even if you don't, there are some really simple things that you can just keep in mind during your labor. One of which is the frequency at which you change position is so important. And again, not those big positions, but the frequency with which you change up your thigh rotation, the frequency of changing up the sacral position, and the frequency of incorporating asymmetry. That's what's going to be so important, that frequency. So I usually like to give every 5 contractions as a guideline. And then from there, we can start thinking about how we can use those simple changes. So changing position every 5 contractions is, I think, a helpful guideline. And that way, I like the number 5 because with 5 contractions, it's long enough that the space that's created is going to be potentially beneficial for the baby. But it's short enough that if the position isn't like ideal in terms of like maybe comfort, or even ideal in terms of like, is it creating space where the baby needs it? It doesn't matter because we're just not there long enough for it to make a difference in a negative way in somebody's labor. So it's another question that I get a lot. Like, if could I ever move too often? No, not really. You can't really move too often in labor unless it's exhausting. Right. But then people are like, well, what if I stay in a position for too long? Well, then, if you really did stay in a position for too long, maybe you're kind of slowing things down, or maybe that's okay. Maybe you just need to rest a little bit. That's also all right. But I like to use 5 as a guideline for frequency of position changes. And when we're talking about position changes, again, it's not those big movements, it's those little movements.
And that could be anywhere, depending on the labor, from like 12 to 30 minutes, right? Like the cadence can be pretty reasonable.
Oh, absolutely. And I like to focus on that too, because then we're not thinking, well, am I in early labor, in which case I should be changing position, X number of minutes, versus like transition, where I should be changing position far more frequently. It doesn't matter. No matter where you are in labor, let's just use 5 contractions. Yeah. And like you said, like it's really going to kind of lend itself easily to what's most ideal for each of those labor phases.
Another piece I love about that is when we're helping as doulas, helping someone through labor, if we can chunk it up into small segments, we're like, all right, let's do this for 5 more contractions or 20 more minutes. Like, okay, I can do 20 minutes. And then we change it up and do something different. So it takes maybe the overwhelming big picture and we kind of break it down into small tasks. So.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, labor can be so overwhelming, especially for first-time parents if they're looking at like a long labor, or somebody who's experienced labor before and they kind of know what they're going to be managing. It can feel really overwhelming. But yeah, I think doulas do a great job at like breaking it down into smaller segments that feel a lot more digestible.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So another tip that I'll share for a movement with an epidural, this is like one of my most favorite things. And I think that it's something that once people start incorporating it, they're like, oh my gosh, this is such a game changer. So I think you probably know what I'm going to say. Rock and roll and circle the peanut ball. So the peanut ball is this prop that is available in the hospitals all over the country. Birth centers have it as well. If you were having a home birth, you would want to, get your own peanut ball. But a peanut ball is shaped like a peanut, and it can be used as a prop. Most commonly, I find that nurses tend to put it in between the thighs. So if somebody is side lying, which is common with an epidural, they might have that peanut ball between their thighs. And that's better than doing nothing because it's incorporating some space change. But I really feel like the peanut ball shines when we move it. So having it between the thighs and then rocking the peanut ball or circling the peanut ball, that's going to incorporate that thigh change, that thigh rotation change. It's going to incorporate a little bit of sacral movement as well. And if you're doing it when somebody's lying on their side, it's asymmetrical because it's that top leg only that's moving. And I love to share this with nurses because nurses can't be in the room the entire time, but typically they are checking in at least once every hour. So they could get somebody comfortable in one of those like basic positions like sideline, and then they could instruct the support person after every 5 contractions, do a different move with the peanut ball, rock it for 5 contractions, then circle it for 5 contractions, then maybe, put it next to the person and drape their leg over it and roll it a little bit for 5 contractions. So I feel like rocking, rolling, circling the peanut ball is such an easy way to incorporate movement during the contraction. And that's when it would be done. That rhythmic movement would be done during the contraction. And it's not the person laboring who's rocking their own peanut ball. It's a support person. It could be a mother, it could be a friend, it could be a doula, it could be a partner. Whoever is there with them, they can literally sit at the side of the bed and they can move that peanut ball, which is going to incorporate little incremental space changes during the contraction, which will help the baby work their way down and out.
I love that. And I think too, when I love the term rock and roll the peanut ball, it slides, right? And so for those who are going to be doing that, we might place it thighs, knees, whatever, and we really side to side rock and roll it back and forth. It's like we're assimilating a exaggerated like walking, right? And so we can have this epidural pelvis, a laying down pelvis, do some awesome movement. But the peanut ball, be prepared if you're going to do it. It does slide, and that's okay. We can just move it back. So it's a little bit of arm work for the person helping, but it does so much for the internal part of the pelvis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's kind of like you mentioned how it simulates walking, which I love that. And I also think for the person that's doing the movement of the peanut ball, it's very similar to like rowing a boat, kind of like you're getting into this like rhythm of your own.
So true. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really simple. And like you said, if it slides out of place, no big deal, because now we're just changing space in a different way. Yep. So yeah, nothing to get stressed out about. It's just like, let's just incorporate more movement than what we were having before.
Absolutely. I almost don't know how to use a peanut ball without an epidural sometimes. I think they're
right?
Such a great tool with an epidural. And that kind of movement may not be tolerated as well by someone who might not have an epidural. So when people get an epidural, I'm like, sweet, let's rock and roll the peanut ball. This is great. Because to march someone through those motions like on their own, those could be some larger, exhausting movements and
Yeah, totally.
facilitate those at a restful period. So it's
Yeah,
great.
I think about that especially with transition. One of my favorite transition moves when somebody is not medicated, when somebody's unmedicated, is the hip lift and twist. So it's standing and then they're like picking their leg up and rotating it around and doing it on the other side and doing that during a contraction. And I can say not only from experience with my clients, but also for myself, it's horrible. It's terrible.
It's
It's super
work.
effective, but it's so much work. And to do that during the transition part of labor in a contraction is like literal insanity, but it's so effective.
Yep.
But when somebody has an epidural, we can mimic that by circling the peanut ball, and they're comfortable. They're not. It's helping to support their labor progress, but they're not having to kind of like do that work on their own, which
Right.
is
We
really
can
nice.
assist
So
them in that. Yeah. So good.
yeah, so the peanut ball is like the epidural's best friend.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry for my cough drop. I have a little tickle in my throat, so
All
you might
good.
hear it rolling around in there.
All good.
So my last tip that I'll share with you, and this is one that I would say like this applies to all labors, but possibly even more so applies to epidurals, just because so commonly when somebody has an epidural, they're encouraged to push their baby out on their back, which is commonly the case for people without an epidural as well. So it definitely applies to everyone. But without an epidural, I think there's greater freedom of movement on your own, which then makes it a little easier if somebody is really set on not being on their back. But anyway, that tip is to free up the sacrum. So to try to be in a position where the sacrum is free to move. So if you're flat on your back, well, let me first say what the sacrum is. Sacrum is that triangular bone at the base of the spine, just above the tailbone. And the sacrum can open significantly, creating more space front to back at the bottom of the pelvis. So when you're pushing a baby out, that's where we need that space at the bottom of the pelvis for the baby's head. I would also argue we need space through the whole pelvis because the shoulders are entering into, but really when we're thinking about incrementally changing that space for the baby's head, we need to make sure that the sacrum can easily be pushed out of the way by the baby's head, which is what will happen if the sacrum is free to move. So if somebody's lying flat on their back, the sacrum can't go anywhere, because we wind up with this stagnant pelvic space. So if instead of being on the back, someone can be just even simply on their side, or in a kneeling position, leaning over the back of the bed, which is totally possible with an epidural, although many providers are not familiar with it. But side lying is a great way to free up the sacrum. And side lying, what research tells us is that side lying position, as compared to lying on your back, also helps to protect the perineum from tearing, which is another great benefit, and better oxygenates babies, and decreases the sense of vulnerability, and decreases the likelihood of episiotomy, and therefore also decreases the likelihood of excessive tearing, like third and fourth degree tears. So we just see so many benefits to just literally like being on the side instead of being on the back. So freeing up the sacrum by side lying or kneeling is a really great way to create that additional space at the bottom of the pelvis to help the baby's head work
And
their
you're talking
way out
about
a little
actual
easily.
delivery, right? Push some part of
Yeah,
pushing and delivery. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I love to free the sacrum up all the time, but
Right.
particularly in pushing, because with pushing so often it's like, okay, let's get into position, and someone's on their back and then their legs are being
Stay
pulled
there.
behind them. And they stay there, yeah, for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and then sometimes wind up having a cesarean birth because their baby didn't come down. It's like, oh, you got so far into that process.
You gotta
So
give it a
yeah, freeing
chance.
up the
Yeah.
sacrum. Yep. Yeah.
Cool.
So, and then, that suggestion to change position every 5 contractions, that applies through all of labor as well. So like with pushing, I would still encourage that frequency of position changing also, which is hard for the person laboring to advocate for that in that moment, because they're putting so much focus on pushing out their baby. To have to divert their energy into like that discussion with their provider is really challenging. So having a supportive person by their side that can help them advocate for that, prenatally talking with their provider about what their expectations are. I mean, that could be a whole other podcast episode, how to
Yes, it
advocate
could.
for your preferences. But yeah, so I think it's
Also putting
important
on
to
a
keep.
birth plan, right? Like you can articulate that
Absolutely.
on a birth plan. I
Absolutely.
plan on moving and be more specific. I think with our birth
Mhm.
preferences, we need to be specific. Like I'm going to move throughout even the pushing phase, because a lot of
Yeah.
even providers like, oh yeah, you can be in any position you want for labor.
hmm
And we also want to know about the actual birth part. So
Right. Yeah. And then make sure like the partner or a support person is on board for advocating for that in the moment, because sometimes, the provider may have heard you say that earlier on, and now like they're just kind of not remembering that maybe, or just not bringing it up. And if
they
you're
don't have a
focused on just push,
habit, right? There's not a habit of
right,
delivering in other positions.
right.
So
Yeah. So having a support person be like, hey, just wanted to remind you, they're going to be on their side and in all fours and trying lots of different stuff. So just letting you know, it's really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those would be my 3 top tips for movement with an epidural. Change position often, rock, roll, circle that peanut ball, which is really the epidural's best friend, and then free up the sacrum, particularly with pushing, to give your baby that extra wiggle room at the bottom.
Very cool. And when I work with clients, I always like to ask them the position they envision themselves giving birth in. And just like so many parts of labor, we can't make the decision today because we don't know with all the factors with which we're working, right? Like some people say, I want to be squatting when I deliver. That's what I want. I'm set on that. But maybe they get to that moment and that's not feeling right, or it's, they don't want to do that anymore. So I think being open, like, all right, what 3 positions might I envision myself pushing my baby out in? And hands and knees, side lying, on their back, squatting, which I've seen all of those happen with an epidural many times. It's very possible. And I don't think people know that. They don't realize the possibilities of movement once an epidural is used as a tool. So Brittany, can you speak a little tiny bit? I can speak for our doula practice and like 20 years of data, but what are epidural rates looking like in your area and or nationally? And then I'll talk about a little bit about our practice's epidural rate. Like these tips are helpful for a lot of people because there's a lot of epidural usage in our country, right? In our birth culture.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I believe the most recent statistic on epidural use nationally is about 76%. So about 3/4 of people are giving birth with an epidural. In the Philadelphia area where I attend births as a doula, we have epidural rates in hospitals somewhere around 90 to 95%. It's really difficult to get great statistics like nationally or even regionally because there's no standardized reporting from one hospital to hospital or state to state. So that's tricky. So, it is a bit, especially with the 90 to 95%, it's a bit anecdotal, but it's also based on conversations that I've had with providers in our area. So I think that seems to be very similar for other large cities around the country. But of course, you can share what you're seeing where you are too.
I'm seeing similar throughout the country in the 90s percentile at a lot of individual hospitals. Sometimes it's 96%, 98%, sometimes it's 91%. And there are regions that have lower rates. But also, an interesting thing to this statistic is we look at the percentage of cesareans, right? And how we bring that. They're going to have epidurals. So are we talking about the percentage of vaginal births that have epidurals or all births? Because right away, we're going to add 30% to, because about 30% of people get a cesarean. So it's interesting, and it does vary, right? If you're a rural hospital, if you're at a big city hospital, and what's available to you. And for our practice, it's about 40% get epidurals over a long period of time. But that is people hiring a doula. Say their goals might be a little different than folks from the general public. But we have about a 40% epidural rate for our practice. I know other doula practices, community-based doula practices, it can be flipped where they might be 60 to 65% epidural rates, even of those who choose not to. And it's important to keep in mind, as in so many things, keep an open mind when we go into our birth experience and expectations, because until we're presented with how our birth unfolds, it's important to have all these tools ready and be flexible to what happens in our labor.
Yeah, absolutely. And another big factor, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say another big factor too that's going to influence epidural rates is induction rates too, which we've seen induction rates skyrocket, not only in the past 20, 30 years, but we've also seen them skyrocket since the start of COVID.
Yes.
So with induction rates on the rise, it's almost, it's completely it's interesting to see how completely tied to not completely, but partially tied to induction rates epidural use is. It's a totally different ballgame, having an induced labor than a spontaneous labor. And it can even change somebody's plan from the start. If they were planning to have a spontaneous labor unmedicated, but now for whatever reason they're having an induction, even going into it, they might be viewing it very differently and then deciding even in advance that their pain medication plan has changed. So lots of factors that go into it. Yeah.
Wow. Cool. Thank you for these awesome tips. Brittany has so much more. Brittany, tell people where we can find more information, more tips. Tell us about that.
So I'm on social media at Blossoming Bellies Birth on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. So that's Blossoming Bellies Birth. And then my website is blossomingBelliesBirth.com. And on my website, I have a lot of resources. There are webinars. Some of them have contact hours for birth professionals, and they're for both expecting parents as well as perinatal professionals. I have workshops for professionals, and then I have a whole bunch of childbirth education options, live in-person classes, live virtual classes, self-paced classes, and then a ton of my webinars are free as well, because I think it's really important for people to get information regardless of what their financial status is, geographical location, whatever. Like, information is so important for positive birth. So I have a whole bunch of webinars that are free, and when you combine them all, they really create a nice solid foundation of education. And then I also offer scholarships for any of my classes, and there's a form that can be filled out on the website to apply for one of those scholarships. So yeah, so that's where they can find me.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, Brittany, thank you for being with us today. This is great information for folks to have. I appreciate it.
So fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Ordinary Doula podcast with Angie Rosier, hosted by Birth Learning. Episode credits will be in the show notes. Tune in next time as we continue to explore the many aspects of giving birth.